Sarah Thompson was exhausted. She had been driving for hours on the lonely stretch of Highway 50 in Nevada, aptly nicknamed the loneliest road in America. The sun had long since set, and the inky darkness of the desert night enveloped her car. The headlights barely seemed to penetrate the gloom, and Sarah found herself struggling to keep her eyes open. As she rounded a bend, her headlights suddenly illuminated a figure on the side of the road. Sarah blinked, surprised to see anyone out here in the middle of nowhere. It was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, with long blonde hair and wearing a white sundress. She was holding out her thumb in the universal sign for hitchhiking. Sarah hesitated for a moment. She had always been taught never to pick up hitchhikers, but something about this girl's desperate expression made her pause. Against her better judgment, Sarah pulled over to the side of the road. "Thank you so much for stopping," the girl said as she climbed into the passenger seat. "I've been out here for hours. I thought no one would ever come by." "What are you doing out here all alone?" Sarah asked, pulling back onto the road. "My boyfriend and I got into a fight," the girl explained. "He left me here. I'm just trying to get to the next town. My name's Emily, by the way." As they drove, Sarah and Emily chatted. Emily was friendly and talkative, and Sarah found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of the situation. After about an hour of driving, they approached a small town. "You can drop me off here," Emily said. "Thank you so much for the ride." Sarah pulled over, and Emily got out of the car. As Sarah watched her walk away, she suddenly realized that Emily had left her purse in the car. "Wait," Sarah called out, grabbing the purse and getting out of the car. "You forgot your..." But when Sarah looked around, Emily was nowhere to be seen. The street was completely empty, with no sign of the young woman in the white dress. Confused, Sarah looked down at the purse in her hands. It was old and worn, the style outdated by at least a few decades. With a growing sense of unease, Sarah opened the purse. Inside, she found an ID card. The photo showed Emily, but the date of birth was from 1952. The expiration date on the card was 1973. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized she had just given a ride to a woman who had been dead for over 50 years. Trembling, Sarah got back in her car and drove to the nearest police station. The officer on duty listened to her story with a grim expression. "You're not the first person to report this," he said. "We've been getting reports of a young woman in a white dress hitchhiking on that stretch of road for decades. Always the same description, always disappearing without a trace." He went on to explain that in 1973, a young woman named Emily Richards had been murdered by her boyfriend after an argument. He had left her body out in the desert. Despite extensive searches, her remains were never found. Sarah left the police station in a daze, unable to comprehend what had happened. As she drove out of town, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. In her rearview mirror, she thought she caught a glimpse of a figure in a white dress standing by the side of the road, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. From that day on, Sarah never drove that stretch of Highway 50 again. But she could never forget the night she gave a ride to a ghost, and the haunting memory of Emily's sad eyes as she vanished into the night. The experience changed Sarah profoundly. She became obsessed with researching the history of Highway 50 and the legend of the vanishing hitchhiker. She discovered that there had been dozens of similar reports over the years, all describing the same young woman in a white dress. Some claimed that Emily's spirit was trapped on that lonely stretch of road, forever reliving the night of her death and seeking help from passing motorists. Others believed that she was trying to lead someone to her remains so that she could finally be laid to rest. Sarah even tracked down Emily's surviving family members, sharing her experience with them. Emily's aging sister wept as Sarah described her encounter, saying that it brought her a strange sense of comfort to know that Emily's spirit was still out there. As the years passed, Sarah's encounter with Emily became something of a local legend. She was interviewed for paranormal TV shows and true crime podcasts. But no matter how many times she told the story, she never could shake the eerie feeling she had experienced that night. Sometimes on dark nights when she couldn't sleep, Sarah would find herself drawn to her car, fighting the urge to drive out to that lonely stretch of Highway 50. Part of her hoped to see Emily again, to get answers to the questions that had haunted her for so long. But another part of her feared what she might find if she ever returned to that desolate desert road. The experience had opened Sarah's eyes to a world beyond what she had previously believed possible. She began to notice other strange occurrences in her life, little hints that the veil between the living and the dead might be thinner than most people realized. But no matter what other paranormal encounters she had in the years that followed, nothing ever quite compared to that night on Highway 50, when she gave a ride to a ghost and touched the mysteries of the afterlife. Jack Miller was a kind-hearted man. At 35, he had already established himself as a successful software engineer in Silicon Valley, but he never forgot his humble roots. That's why, when he saw the young man with a broken-down car on the side of the road during his drive back from a camping trip in Yosemite, he didn't hesitate to pull over. "Need a hand?" Jack called out as he approached the stranded motorist. The young man, who introduced himself as Ethan, looked relieved. "Man, you're a lifesaver. My car just died, and I've got no cell service out here." Jack took a look under the hood, but it was clear the problem was beyond his abilities to fix. "Tell you what," he said, "why don't I give you a ride to the next town? You can call a tow truck from there." Ethan gratefully accepted, and soon they were on their way. As they drove, Jack found Ethan to be pleasant company. The young man talked about his dreams of becoming a musician and his recent cross-country trip to find himself. About an hour into the drive, Ethan suddenly tensed up. "Hey, do you mind if we take a little detour? There's someone I need to check on." Jack was hesitant, but Ethan assured him it wouldn't take long. "It's my cousin," he explained. "He lives out here, off the grid. I promised my mom I'd stop by and make sure he's okay." Against his better judgment, Jack agreed. Ethan directed him down a series of increasingly remote dirt roads until they arrived at a dilapidated cabin in the woods. "This is it," Ethan said. "Do you mind waiting here? I'll just be a minute." Jack watched as Ethan disappeared into the cabin. Minutes ticked by, and Jack's unease grew. Just as he was about to leave, Ethan emerged, but he wasn't alone. Two large, rough-looking men accompanied him. Before Jack could react, the men had yanked open his car door and dragged him out. He felt a sharp pain in his head, and everything went black. When Jack regained consciousness, he found himself bound and gagged in what appeared to be a basement. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and in the dim light, he could make out shapes that looked disturbingly like human remains. Over the next few days, Jack experienced a nightmare beyond anything he could have imagined. Ethan and his accomplices, who Jack learned were part of a backwoods cult, subjected him to physical and psychological torture. They spoke of cleansing him and preparing him for some sort of ritual sacrifice. Jack's mind raced, trying to figure out a way to escape. He overheard his captors talking about other victims they had lured in the same way, kind-hearted people who had stopped to help a stranger in need. On the third night of his captivity, Jack managed to work his bonds loose. While his captors were distracted with some sort of bizarre ceremony upstairs, he made his escape. Barefoot and bloodied, he ran through the woods, driven by pure adrenaline and the will to survive. By some miracle, Jack stumbled upon a highway and was picked up by a passing trucker. The authorities were alerted, but by the time they reached the cabin, Ethan and his cult had vanished, leaving behind only evidence of their gruesome crimes. The experience left Jack deeply traumatized. He spent months in therapy, struggling to come to terms with what had happened to him and the fate of the other victims who hadn't been as fortunate as he was. The police investigation revealed a horrifying truth. Ethan and his cult had been operating for years, preying on Good Samaritans across multiple states. They were part of a larger network of criminals who exploited people's kindness for their own twisted purposes. Jack's story made national headlines, sparking a debate about the dangers of helping strangers and the balance between compassion and personal safety. While many praised Jack's bravery, others criticized his naivety in following Ethan to such a remote location. For Jack, the aftermath was a constant struggle. He battled PTSD and found it difficult to trust anyone. His once successful career faltered as he struggled to concentrate on his work, Relationships became nearly impossible as he flinched at every unexpected touch or sound. Yet amid the darkness, Jack found a new purpose. He became an advocate for victims' rights and worked to raise awareness about the tactics used by predators like Ethan. He spoke at schools and community centers, sharing his story in the hope of preventing others from falling into similar traps. Jack also became involved in search and rescue operations, channeling his trauma into a determination to help find and save other victims of violent crimes. It was during one of these searches that he had a breakthrough in his own healing process. As he combed through a dense forest looking for a missing hiker, Jack realized that despite everything he had been through, he hadn't lost his fundamental desire to help others. He had just learned to balance it with a heightened awareness of potential dangers. Years passed, and while the scars of his ordeal never fully faded, Jack found a way to reclaim his life. He married a fellow survivor he met through his advocacy work, and together they built a life focused on healing and helping others. But no matter how much time passed, Jack never forgot the lesson he learned on that fateful day, that sometimes the real monsters aren't the strangers who need our help, but those who exploit our best instincts for their own evil ends. Jack's story serves as a chilling reminder that while compassion is a virtue, it must always be tempered with caution. In a world where darkness can lurk behind the most innocent facades, even a simple act of kindness can lead to unimaginable horrors. Melissa Carter was a 22-year-old college student driving home for Thanksgiving break. It was late, and the rural Pennsylvania roads were dark and winding. Her old Ford Fiesta sputtered and coughed, the check engine light blinking ominously. Melissa silently prayed the car would make it to her parents' house, still 2 hours away. As she rounded a bend, her headlights illuminated a figure on the roadside. It was a man, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and a weathered face. He was waving his arms frantically, and as Melissa slowed down, she could see the distress on his face. Against her better judgment, Melissa pulled over. The man hurried to her window, his eyes wild with panic. "Please, you've got to help me," he gasped. "My granddaughter, she's sick. Our car broke down a mile back, and I need to get her to a hospital." Melissa hesitated, her hand hovering over the door lock. The man must have sensed her reluctance because he stepped back, his hands raised. "I know how this looks," he said softly. "A strange man on a dark road. But I swear on my life, I'm telling the truth. Please, she's only 6 years old." Something in the man's voice, the raw desperation, made Melissa's decision for her. She unlocked the doors. "Get in," she said. "We'll go get your granddaughter." The man, who introduced himself as Frank, directed Melissa down the road. True to his word, they soon came upon a broken-down pickup truck. In the passenger seat was a small figure, wrapped in a blanket. Frank carried the child to Melissa's car, placing her gently in the back seat. In the rearview mirror, Melissa could see the little girl's pale face, her eyes closed and her breathing labored. "The nearest hospital is in Millbrook," Frank said, "about 30 miles east." Melissa nodded and stepped on the gas. As they drove, Frank kept turning to check on his granddaughter, his face etched with worry. Melissa found herself praying again, this time for the little girl in her back seat. They had been driving for about 20 minutes when Melissa's car began to sputter. The engine coughed once, twice, and then died completely. Melissa managed to coast to the side of the road before the car came to a stop. "No, no, no," she muttered, turning the key frantically. The engine wouldn't catch. Frank placed a hand on her arm. "It's okay," he said. "I'll go for help. You stay here with Amy." Before Melissa could protest, Frank was out of the car and jogging down the road. She watched his figure disappear into the darkness, then turned to look at the little girl in the back seat. "Amy?" she called softly. "Are you awake?" There was no response. Concerned, Melissa got out of the car and opened the back door. She reached out to check on the child, pulling back the blanket. What she found made her blood run cold. It wasn't a little girl at all, but a crude mannequin dressed in children's clothes. Where the face should have been was a crudely drawn smile, the eyes nothing more than black X's. Melissa stumbled backward, her heart pounding. She fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal. Panic rising in her throat, she looked up and down the empty road. Frank was nowhere to be seen. Just then, she heard a noise from the trunk of her car, a muffled thump, followed by what sounded like scratching. With trembling hands, Melissa approached the trunk. She hesitated for a moment, then popped it open. Inside, bound and gagged, was a young woman. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she was trying desperately to speak through her gag. Melissa quickly untied her. "Who are you?" she gasped. "What's going on?" The woman, sobbing with relief, managed to choke out her story. Her name was Rachel, and she had been kidnapped by Frank and his partners 3 days ago. They had been using the sick child ruse to lure Good Samaritans, then robbing and often killing them. Rachel had overheard them planning to dump her body and find a new victim tonight. "We have to get out of here," Rachel said urgently. "They'll be back soon." But it was too late. Headlights appeared on the road, approaching fast. Melissa and Rachel barely had time to hide in the woods before 2 vehicles pulled up. Frank emerged from one, accompanied by 3 other men. They were all armed. For the next few hours, Melissa and Rachel played a terrifying game of cat and mouse in the dark forest. They could hear Frank and his partners searching for them, their voices echoing through the trees. At one point, a bullet whizzed past Melissa's ear, embedding itself in a nearby trunk. As dawn broke, Melissa and Rachel finally stumbled onto a main road. A passing truck driver stopped to help them, and soon the police were on the scene. Frank and his partners were arrested after a brief standoff, and it was revealed that they were responsible for a string of disappearances and murders across 3 states. The aftermath of that night haunted Melissa for years. She struggled with severe PTSD and found it difficult to trust anyone. The sight of a broken-down car or a hitchhiker would send her into a panic attack. She dropped out of college and became a virtual recluse, afraid to leave her apartment. But slowly, with therapy and support from her family and Rachel, with whom she had formed a close bond, Melissa began to heal. She eventually returned to school, switching her major to criminal justice. She was determined to help prevent others from falling victim to predators like Frank. Years later, Melissa became a detective specializing in missing persons cases. Her experience gave her a unique insight into the minds of both victims and perpetrators. She became known for her ability to crack cases that others had given up on. But no matter how many cases she solved, Melissa never forgot that night on the dark Pennsylvania road. It served as a constant reminder of how quickly life can change, and how the line between being a good Samaritan and a victim can be terrifyingly thin. Melissa's story became a cautionary tale, taught in criminology classes and cited in safety campaigns. It highlighted the dangers of trusting strangers too readily, while also showcasing the incredible resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable terror. For Melissa, every day was a battle between her instinct to help others and her hard-earned knowledge of the risks involved. But she refused to let fear rule her life. Instead, she channeled her experiences into protecting others, turning her nightmare into a force for good in the world. Brandon Cooper was a 28-year-old freelance photographer known for his stunning landscape shots of the American Southwest. His latest assignment had taken him deep into the Mojave Desert, capturing the stark beauty of its vast, empty spaces. As he drove his rental car back towards Las Vegas, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. It was in this moment of distraction, admiring the sunset, that Brandon nearly missed the figure standing by the side of the road. He slammed on the brakes, sending up a cloud of dust. The hitchhiker, a woman who appeared to be in her early 30s, looked at him with a mixture of hope and desperation. Brandon rolled down his window. "Are you okay?" he called out. The woman, who introduced herself as Allison, explained that her car had broken down several miles back. She had been walking for hours, hoping to reach the next town. "I can give you a ride," Brandon offered, his photographer's eye noting how Allison's blonde hair caught the last rays of the setting sun. Allison gratefully accepted, climbing into the passenger seat. As they drove, she told Brandon about her job as a geologist, studying the unique rock formations of the desert. Brandon found her fascinating, and they fell into easy conversation. As night fell, the desert transformed. The once friendly landscape became alien and foreboding in the darkness. Brandon noticed Allison growing increasingly agitated, constantly checking the rearview mirror. "Is everything okay?" he asked. Allison forced a smile. Just a bit jumpy. It's silly, but I always feel like someone's watching me out here in the desert. Brandon tried to reassure her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no signs of the town Allison had mentioned. Suddenly, Allison gasped. "Stop the car!" she cried. Brandon slammed on the brakes. "What's wrong?" Allison was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I thought I saw something, someone following us." Brandon peered into the darkness behind them, but saw nothing. "There's no one there," he said gently, but Allison was insistent. She begged Brandon to turn off the road, to hide. Against his better judgment, Brandon complied, driving a short distance into the desert and killing the lights. They sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound their rapid breathing. Then they heard it, the distant rumble of an engine growing louder. A vehicle appeared on the road they had just left, moving slowly. Its headlights swept across the desert, as if searching for something, or someone. Allison was shaking now. "They found me," she whispered. "Who found you?" Brandon demanded, but Allison just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. The vehicle passed, and Brandon turned to Allison for an explanation. But the words died in his throat as he saw what she was holding. A wicked-looking knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. "I'm so sorry," Allison said, her voice breaking. "They have my daughter. They said if I didn't bring them someone else, they'd kill her." Before Brandon could react, headlights flooded the car. They were surrounded. Rough hands dragged him from the vehicle, and something hard struck the back of his head. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was Allison's tear-stained face mouthing "I'm sorry" over and over. Brandon awoke to find himself in a nightmare. He was in some kind of underground bunker, chained to a wall. Around him were other captives, all in various states of despair. Over the next few days, Brandon learned the horrifying truth. He had stumbled into the clutches of a desert cult, one that believed in human sacrifice to appease ancient gods. They used people like Allison, threatening their loved ones to force them to lure in new victims. Brandon's days became a blur of terror and pain. He watched as other captives were taken away, never to return. He heard their screams echoing through the bunker. All the while, he desperately sought a way to escape. His chance came during one of the cult's bizarre rituals. In the chaos of chanting and dancing, Brandon managed to slip his chains and make a run for it. He fled into the desert night, with no idea where he was or which direction led to safety. For 3 days, Brandon stumbled through the unforgiving landscape. The sun blistered his skin by day, while the cold desert nights left him shivering. He was delirious from dehydration when a group of hikers finally found him. The authorities were skeptical of Brandon's story at first, but as they investigated, they uncovered a horror beyond imagination. The cult had been operating for decades, responsible for hundreds of disappearances. The bunker was found, along with evidence of unspeakable crimes. Allison was among those arrested. When confronted by Brandon, she broke down, revealing that her daughter had been a lie, just another tactic used by the cult to ensure compliance. The aftermath of his ordeal left Brandon a changed man. He abandoned his photography career, unable to look at the desert landscapes he once loved without seeing the horrors that lurked beneath the surface. He became an advocate for hitchhiking safety and missing persons, using his story to warn others of the dangers that can befall even the most well-intentioned traveler. Years of therapy helped Brandon cope with his trauma, but he never fully recovered. He was haunted by survivor's guilt, tormented by thoughts of those he left behind in that underground hell. Every missing persons report, every unsolved disappearance, made him wonder if the cult's influence stretched further than anyone realized. Brandon's experience shed light on a dark underbelly of American society, isolated communities where unthinkable acts could occur unnoticed. It sparked discussions about the vulnerability of travelers and the ease with which predators could exploit human kindness. For Brandon, the Mojave Desert would forever remain a place of nightmares, a stark reminder that sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones in stories, but the seemingly ordinary people we encounter in our daily lives. His story serves as a chilling warning to all who hear it. In the vast emptiness of the desert, a simple act of kindness can lead down a road from which there may be no return. Detective Lisa Reeves had seen her fair share of gruesome crime scenes in her 15 years on the force, but nothing could have prepared her for what she encountered on that chilly October morning. The call had come in just after dawn, an abandoned car found on the side of a lonely stretch of highway, its interior covered in blood. As Lisa approached the vehicle, a sleek black sedan, she could smell the metallic scent of blood even before she opened the door. Inside, the upholstery was soaked red, with splatter patterns indicating a violent struggle. But there was no body. "What do we know?" Lisa asked the first officer on the scene. "Car belongs to a Tyler Matthews, 32, software engineer from Seattle," the officer replied. "He was reported missing by his wife 3 days ago. Said he was driving down to San Francisco for a job interview, but never arrived." Lisa nodded, her mind already racing through possibilities. As she examined the car, something caught her eye, a small scrap of paper wedged between the seats. On it was scrawled a single word: help. The investigation that followed would take Lisa down a rabbit hole of terror, uncovering a series of similar disappearances stretching back over a decade. All followed the same pattern: lone drivers on long trips, vanishing without a trace. The only common factor? Each had picked up a hitchhiker shortly before their disappearance. Months passed, and the case consumed Lisa. She pored over witness statements, traffic camera footage, and autopsy reports for the few bodies that had been found. A picture began to emerge of a highly intelligent, methodical killer who used the vulnerability of isolated highways to hunt his prey. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a truck driver named Mike Hansen. Mike had picked up a hitchhiker matching the description of their suspect, but something about the man had made him uneasy. He dropped the hitchhiker off at the next rest stop and thought nothing more of it until he saw the police sketch on the news. With Mike's information, Lisa and her team were able to narrow their search. They focused on a 100-mile stretch of highway where most of the disappearances had occurred. Patrols were increased, and warnings were issued to drivers about picking up hitchhikers. Then, on a rainy night in April, they got lucky. A patrol car spotted a man matching the suspect's description walking along the highway. When they approached him, he fled into the woods. What followed was a tense manhunt that lasted through the night. Lisa was part of the team that finally cornered the suspect in an abandoned barn. As they closed in, Lisa could hear him talking to someone, but when they burst in, he was alone. The man, who identified himself as Robert Grimes, didn't resist arrest. In fact, he seemed almost relieved to be caught. But it was what they found in the barn that would haunt Lisa for years to come. Hidden beneath a trapdoor was a makeshift dungeon. Inside were photos and personal effects of dozens of victims, many more than they had originally suspected. But most disturbing of all was a journal in which Grimes had meticulously documented each of his crimes. The journal revealed a killer with a twisted philosophy. Grimes believed he was liberating his victims from their mundane lives, offering them transcendence through death. He saw highways as liminal spaces, perfect for his grim work of transformation. During his interrogation, Grimes was calm and articulate. He spoke of his crimes as if they were art pieces, each murder a carefully crafted experience. He claimed to have a special connection with his victims, that he could sense which drivers would pick him up, which ones were ready for his brand of liberation. "I was a gift to them," he told Lisa, his eyes gleaming with a fervor that made her skin crawl. "I freed them from the tedium of their existence. In their final moments, they understood. They were grateful." The trial that followed was a media sensation. Grimes, representing himself, turned the courtroom into a stage for his deranged philosophy. His eloquence and apparent lack of remorse chilled all who heard him speak. In the end, Grimes was convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for Lisa and the families of the victims, the end of the trial brought little closure. The case changed Lisa profoundly. She became an advocate for highway safety, pushing for increased patrols and emergency call boxes along isolated stretches of road. She gave lectures at police academies, using the Grimes case as a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk in the most unexpected places. But in her quieter moments, Lisa was haunted by the things she'd seen and heard. She couldn't shake the memory of Grimes' eerily calm demeanor, or the gratitude some of his victims had apparently shown in their final moments, according to his journal. Most of all, she was troubled by the question that had gone unanswered. Who was Grimes talking to in the barn when they found him? Despite thorough searches, no accomplice was ever found. Grimes himself offered no explanation, only an enigmatic smile when asked. Years later, long after she had left the force, Lisa would still find herself avoiding long drives on lonely highways, and sometimes on dark nights when sleep eluded her, she could almost believe that somewhere out there, a figure was still walking along the roadside, thumb outstretched, waiting for the next unsuspecting driver to stop. The Grimes case served as a chilling reminder that evil can wear a friendly face, and that the most dangerous predators are often those who can exploit our basic human kindness. It changed the way many people viewed hitchhiking and solo travel, casting a long shadow over the American tradition of the open road. In the end, the true horror of the Grimes case lay not just in the acts themselves, but in the way it shook people's faith in humanity. It left a lasting scar on the American psyche, a reminder that sometimes the simple act of helping a stranger can lead to unimaginable consequences.